to everybody. We're glad you're here today, whether you're listening to us live or you're listening to this on demand, as we have the capability to record these sessions. And by the way, that's a good thing to mention, that there's an on-demand library for everyone in the Tennessee Independent Association of Schools, Tennessee Association of Independent Schools. I'll get the TA and the I in the right order there. That you can go back or share with those within your school, and at the end you can send them the link and they can register and listen to it at a later date. So today we're focused on school and workplace recovery. Your school is a workplace, and finding a place to work and learn post a disaster. We certainly have had many things in the news with all of the hurricanes over the last few weeks, the wildfires out in California, the earthquake down in Mexico, even the violence in Las Vegas. If you look at these things, and what are we going to do, and how do we deal with that, and how do we keep on being a school with those things going on around us? So hopefully you'll learn some new things today, or at least some things to think about, and we'll talk more about it as we go on. We'd like you to be our friends on social media, on Twitter. We're at Firestorm Soul, on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. There is a hashtag today for this session called hashtag Crisis Coach. By the way, you can reach us on that at any time because we're monitoring it on a regular basis. So it's important to keep up with what's going on and sharing those areas. And Firestorm transforms crisis into value for the schools and organizations that we assist. And we empower you to manage crisis and risk, two very different things as we consider them. And our expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach, and we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. And hopefully today you'll learn some things to think about as we go into this subject further. As there is a disclaimer, we have attorneys just like everyone else, and they make us do this every time to say the presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and any work product provided by Firestorm must be read in conjunction with all guidance given by regional and national authorities, as well as the legal counsel for your school. And today's webinar should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. So today from the TAIS, we normally would have Dr. Rich Martin, but Rich is out helping schools, as he always is, I've noticed, and Jill doing the same thing. It wouldn't surprise me they're in two different parts of the state. And in fact, we're going to be running a special program after the first of the year where we're going to be holding a program in Memphis, Nashville, and Knoxville. And look for some details coming forward, and we'll cover those in future webinars. So our thanks to the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools and everything that they do to support our schools and our young people. It certainly makes a difference that you're there. I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm the CEO and president of Firestorm. I am also one of the founders of the company, as we're looking at. Looks like I was fairly happy the day they shot that picture. Not necessarily the image that you're thinking about when we think about some of the topics that we're going to talk about. We did a survey earlier this year, and we did it both of businesses and schools and other types of organizations about what's the crisis event that would be their number one concern. And not surprisingly, the workplace violence or school violence and terrorist event, that was over a fourth, where really that was their number one concern. And we spend a great deal of time in our webinar series and our work with you in talking about those types of events, and have a special program called Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment that helps you identify those behaviors of concern before they escalate to violence. And there's a special program for the TAIS schools, and if you want to know more about that, let us know. Cyber attack is clearly, and we're seeing schools being targeted, particularly independent and private schools in this area. And I think the awareness level around the Equifax breach certainly has intensified that for everyone. And then brand and reputation events. We're seeing the sexual molestation issue that arises from prior years coming back being a key element. And then the hardest thing that anyone ever has to do is to deal with a loss of life event. Dr. Steger, who was the president of Virginia Tech, had to pick that phone up and make 32 phone calls to families to tell them that their loved one wasn't coming home that day. And it's certainly not an area that you want to be involved in. But about a fourth of everyone in the survey said natural disaster and devastation. Now, I want to point out that this research was done prior to the recent hurricanes. So no impact from Harvey, no impact from Irma, Maria, Nate, no impact from the earthquake in California, and no impact from the horrific wildfires that we're seeing in California. If we were to do this again today with that fresh in everyone's mind, I believe that 24% would probably double in looking at that. So it's good that we're going to be talking about something a little different. And when we looked at the season and the scheduling it, I would like to tell you we were very smart to say, oh, well, that'll happen. We weren't. It's just how it's gotten us to where we are today. And so what we really want to do is to get you to start to focus on what would you do if this was your school. If you look at the C.E. King High School, I'm thinking that when this picture was taken, they weren't planning on having a football game that day. They weren't planning on having the school open. And that's going to be a significant disruption. So what we want you to do is to stop today and think in an area that's a little different than all of our other conversations. Here we're focused on what will you do to be able to continue school. And so this is a continuity of operations or a business continuity plan perspective that you need to think about. And it's one that most of our schools don't do the stop and think, because this is an area that you're exposed to. Now, you may not be a coastal school. Clearly, if we were dealing with a school on St. Simon's Island down off the coast of Georgia, they would be concerned about a hurricane. Not many schools in Tennessee are going to be that concerned about the hurricane, but we've had heavy flooding in the past in Nashville. You've got a potential for heavy flooding along Memphis. Any particular area, those could happen, and clearly tornadoes have been a major factor in Tennessee as we look at those issues. So as we think about these things, what are we going to do for our school to be able to continue operations in these types of events? Now, the picture that you see here is of a crane that's collapsed in Miami recently with Hurricane Irma when it came through. But the question is, have you tested your plan? You're saying, well, we'll let everybody work from home. Well, great. Let's take a day, pick a Friday, pick a Thursday, and say we're going to have all of our students dial in and we're going to do work from home. Or if you set up a relationship with a memorandum of understanding with another facility near you, we're going to run school at the church down the street on Friday, and we're going to see what that's like. When you walk through it in the environment that you find yourself in, you're going to find that many of your assumptions won't work out the way that you thought, and you have to change it. So testing your plan becomes absolutely critical. And I'll stop and mention it on this slide. In the Medicare and Medicaid have seen a big gap in 17 different types of healthcare facilities in their ability to respond if the disaster happened to them. And now they're requiring them to update their hazard analysis, to have an emergency operations plan, to crisis communications plan, that they have to test their plans both with a tabletop and a full simulation, or they'll remove all Medicare and Medicaid funding from them. Well, if it's important for a healthcare facility, how much more important is it for a school, and particularly your school, to be prepared in those areas? So testing plans becomes critical. So when we think about a natural disaster, by the way, here's an email from that school that was sent out by the superintendent. But I want you to read this email and take a moment to think about the impact that natural disasters have had on schools. And these schools are exactly like yours. While this picture was of a public school, it could have been an independent or private school just as well. And the focus should always be is how do we get back to school? How do we get back to being school? That's who we are, that's what we do, and that's where we come from. So as you think in each of these areas, Harvey, Irma, Maria, Nate, the Mexican earthquakes, the wildfires in California, what's next? Clearly, shock waves from the Las Vegas shootings have kept that in everyone's mind, and violence coming to our town or into our area or to our school certainly shifts us. The combination of all of these should start with a hazard impact analysis, a hazard vulnerability threat assessment. And below you see the header from a hazard impact matrix. You list the type of events down in the left-hand column, dividing them into reputation or natural disasters or man-made, and you put a probability by them. Clearly, a tornado, there could be a highly probable event that occurs because it happens across Tennessee. What's the event forewarning? Do we have less than an hour? Clearly in a tornado, that would be the case. How long could it last? While the event itself might be short, the impact of that would last over a much longer period of time. And then we think about the severity from the human side, the property side, and our ability to operate. Now, if all of those were at the worst possible area, 5 across, it would give you a base risk level of 100%. Now, you can mitigate those risks by putting plans in place. Pre-action, developing plans, having everybody do, test and work through them, but having the right resources, the right external resources, where are we going to go, and then that will create a crisis, a risk index, so it would be mitigated. And so in this example, if it had been an extremely high risk level, 100, if you had done those things at the best of your ability, you would have dropped it down to a 60%. Now, in this type of planning, any risk that is greater, index greater than 40%, you must have plans in place. That's best practices and standards associated with it. If you haven't done this type of an approach, Firestorm would be delighted to work with you to help you do this. It might even be a good time to have a security risk threat assessment of your campus done at the same time. But this is where you would start, because from this information will guide you in all the decisions that you have to make. Now, there are 2 types of damages in any of these areas. One is the damage to the structure and your contents, and the other is damage to your people, because it's not going to just hit the school. It's going to hit their homes, their community, all of those other, and it's going to cause a disruption. Now, think about your school. What would happen if you weren't able to hold classes for 2 weeks or a month? Do you have to refund tuition? Does your insurance cover that? I would recommend that you describe the events that you've just been seeing going on television with the hurricanes or the wildfires, and go back to your insurance broker, and I would go back in writing and saying, if this happened to our school, can you please share with me how our insurance would respond and what our exposures are financially to that? What we have found is that most schools haven't taken that step, and in many cases what you think is covered will turn out not to be covered, and you'll have exposures in other areas that you'll need to address. So stop, take a moment, think about those, and if you do tabletop exercises, every time you do one, I would turn that over to your insurance broker and have them explain how your insurance would respond in that particular event. So if we move from that and look at these events on a national level, and we ultimately are going to have to look at them on a personal level at what's happening at your school, you'll see the early estimates for Harvey were $3 billion. Those now have gone up through other impacts associated with it, and when it said the financial, JP Morgan indicated the insurance would lose 10 to 20 billion. I believe that the uninsured losses would be well in excess of that. In fact, that total number is going up and continues to do so. If you add Irma in and you add the others, these hurricanes this year will probably be a $200 to $300 billion event. And the impact on that will certainly hurt us. We've already seen the jobs forecast from last month indicating that America lost jobs instead of gaining jobs. And these types of events are key drivers in it. And clearly, if you look at Puerto Rico, it's not going to be back to school as usual there. It's an extended environment that will be significantly different for a long period of time. We saw in Georgia, and I'm sure you saw the same thing in Tennessee, higher gas prices, over 1 million businesses impacted. And even if you weren't directly in the path of one of these things, some of your students' families were, some of your suppliers could have been, there could have been significant disruption. We certainly saw air travel across the southeast disrupted, and it even included Tennessee. And the ground transportation in the areas where the events were disrupted, I don't think you'd be driving down that road in the picture that you see there. And we're all going to feel it when we go to the grocery store with the damage that we've seen to our crops and areas. So the impacts are great in general, but let's get down to specifics. If you look at this picture, and it's one that Karen Mazzullo, who's on the call with us today, our Chief Intelligence Officer, shared that was happening where she is, and you look at that road, nobody's going to school down that road anytime soon. Now, you may not have an ocean outside where you are, but you've got a river, and I was on a phone call earlier today with Regis. They have the dynamic recovery that offices use and companies use, and he was reminding me about the bridge that collapsed in Minnesota a few years ago, and there was no storm going on. It was a structural failure, and it was the one cross point that that bridge would bring, and it was a significant impact. So we don't even have to have a natural disaster to have this situation where people can't get from point A to point B. All of us thinks about then, this relates to what's our alternative learning options? What can we do? All right, well, if our school's intact, we could start a little later, maybe do some weekends and try to catch up, or we could have a memorandum of understanding with someone local, a church or another school, of how we could use their facility, or we could do this virtually. Firestorm uses a company called freeconferencecall.com. By the way, I have to love a price that starts out with free. And we do conference calls regularly there, and there is no cost to us to do so. You could set that up, and each one of your teachers could have a free conference call line, and the students could call into it, and that would give you a workaround strategy. By the way, that also has an option that you could set up a web meeting for up to 400 people. So the teacher could have their class, if they were in a remote location and had internet access and access to a computer, could dial in with voice over the computer or over a telephone line, and the teacher could bring up on their desktop the PowerPoint or the curriculum or anything they wanted to share. So you'd have the visual in addition to hearing the description of what you needed to do. And for a period of time, you could at least have class, give out homework assignments, do a follow-up, and make those things happen. If you look at the banner there from Woodsboro Pride, I certainly think they may have pride, but they certainly are going to need a new banner after the events that hit them. But if you're thinking about alternative locations, you're going to need to think about safety, because safety in your school environment is a little more predictable. You have fences around your property. You keep your external doors locked. You may have locking classrooms, which is the standard and best practices. So if you go into a church facility, you may not have that, or even another school. Shelter, health, hygiene. We're dealing with a school who is offshore, and there's looking at holding classes by sitting down underneath the trees and at least letting the students be there to talk from that location as they're going through it. Well, that would work, except if it was January in Tennessee, it might be a cold, snowy day, and so I'm not sure that that's going to work out so well. And also in those environments, remember that you need sanitation, you need toilets, you need running water in order to do it. We could probably get along without the electricity for a little while, but having the loss of sanitation and the loss of water would be a significant factor. How are we going to feed people and conduct it? If you think you can do this in your school and there's no electricity, or you had some minimum damage, it would be an interesting experiment to run. Pick a date and say, okay, this Friday we're going to have classes at school, but for the morning we're going to not have any electricity. We're going to turn electricity off and see how we would be able to do class without electricity, without internet, without all the things that we've been used to, as if it was the early 1900s or late 1800s, to see how those elements would run. Clearly, in a winter environment, you can't, but you might be able to do some things of interest. Now, so we've got multiple options. Go somewhere else or go to a remote learning capabilities over an internet type of a structure. I want to keep driving home, though, you've got to understand this is the environment that your people will be in. Those houses that are shown there, whether it was a teacher or students or their parents, I'm thinking those people aren't quite ready to return to those houses in the middle of this. The pictures that I saw today from the wildfires in California, there were no homes to return to. They were completely gone. Well, those students may have to move outside the area. How do you identify them? How do you communicate with them? What do you need to do? Those are all questions that we want you to answer today and not when those areas come into play. Now, we've done some webinars this month for businesses for today, and we're obviously talking about schools with you, but we team regularly with a firm called Regis. They are a global company with thousands of locations around the world, and they do a thing called dynamic recovery. You don't have to go to one particular location, you can do it. I don't see that as a viable option for your school other than maybe your leadership or crisis team if they needed a place to meet. But they have a lot of statistics in this area, and I think the key here is to start to say, what does this mean to me in my school environment? Now, if you've done a business continuity program or a continuity of operations, you've identified who your critical vendors are, who your service providers are. But if you look at the statistics, 9% of most vendors have not demonstrated that they have the ability to recover. Only 19% had ever shared their plans. If you're dependent on a third party, then you need to have audited their plans to make sure that they can show up. If you've got food service, janitorial, if you've got security, who are those vendors that are critical for you to operate to make sure you understand? And you'll notice that in a business environment, less than a third have successfully ever recovered from these types of events. And you look at those pictures in Houston or Miami or Orlando, a lot of those companies won't be able to survive. Now, as you're thinking about your school and where you would go to have classes, you certainly, we have found across, and Regis shared with us, which I think is a great insight, that people aren't generally willing to drive much further than they do on a normal day. So if they've had a 20 or a 30-minute drive or an hour drive, they'd still be willing to do that. But if they had a 5-minute drive, they're not willing to do an hour or a 2-hour drive to get to school or to get to work. So as you're thinking about your school, if something were to happen to your building and you wanted to go to an alternative site, I would recommend that you think of it in a series of concentric circles. What's within a mile radius of your campus? Who is there that you could have a relationship with, that if something happened to your building, that you could go there? The advantage is it's not far from where you are. Your parents and students would be able to find, and your teachers easily, the facility. The negative of being within a mile is whatever happened to you could have happened to them, and you won't be able to reach that. It might not be available either. So I would do a 1-mile radius, a 5-mile radius, and a 10-mile radius from your school, recognizing that if somebody was east and the 10-mile radius went west, it could be an extra 20 miles to get there. And with all of the other environments, it would make a difference. But I would identify at least one alternative in each of those 3 zones, within a mile, within 10 miles, and within 20. If you want to be safe when you get to the 10 and 20 miles, I would try to do not a backup. It's just solely in one direction. I would pick one in a second. And I think having 2 in the 10-mile range and 2 in the 20-mile range will help you to have that understanding, and then put something in writing so you'd have a memorandum of understanding. If you need assistance from that, Firestorm would be glad to work with you. The other thing that was startling, so the first thing of number one is if it's too close, they could have the same problem. If it's too small, it's not going to work. You can't put 500 students in an area that could handle 30, and if it's way too far, they're not going to go. Regis identified that one of the number one concerns that businesses had was safety and security. And it will be certainly true for your school. At your current school, you may have a fence. You keep your school building locked. You keep your classrooms locked. You have cameras. You have alarms. You go to a backup facility, you may not have any of those. So physical security is an issue for you to be focused on as you're thinking about those areas. So where do we start? Well, the points to consider in all of this are, what are the decisions you're going to have to make? What are the actions you're going to have to take? And what are the words that you need to say? If you look at those, that's where we would start to work. Now, we've talked about the hazard vulnerability risk assessment to start our discussions today. So you've got to predict, what are our vulnerabilities? Who are our key people? What are the processes? What's our plan? And then finally, you have to perform, and the performing is training and testing and using those capabilities to be put into place. That gives you a structure to arrive in those areas. Now, to come back about remote learning, if that neighborhood is flooded and people can't work from home, they're not going to be able to show up. I don't think the Deweyville Elementary School opened quickly after the flooding that you see there. The building to the right on the screen is from Joplin, where the tornado hit it. That school isn't going to be open this week or next week. So how long will it take? What can you do? Thinking about that today would be a real, a necessary, essential element for us. And that picture on the right is not unreasonable to assume you have that exposure in the state of Tennessee. Now, if we look on the points to consider, will you be able to continue your operations remotely with people at home in an alternative location? Have you thought about home-based learning for a period of time as a recovery strategy? What are your requirements? How would you do tests? How would you get books to people? How would you make them available? Can you set up a site where it's a Dropbox? You can put materials in it. It could be downloaded by the student to be able to have access and have involvement. Have you ever tested it? We don't want you to use a remote learning solution if you've never used it before, so you must test this. And if it's about another location, I would strongly recommend that you test that and go and run the school there in that area at least once to find out what was different. And after you do any of these tests, you want to do a hot wash. That's a review of what worked well, what didn't work well, and what are the lessons learned. And so one of the things, if we were a public school, we know in many of these areas, the public school has been commandeered as a shelter. And think about running school with people that you don't know that are there, that are displaced. Now, while you say, well, we probably wouldn't do that in our school, but if you were forced into your remote location, and it was a church, they may well have opened it up to their members or the community. So you're mixing two populations, your school population and those that are there that are displaced. And so that security comment earlier becomes very important. So again, your continuity plan would be telling you, what's the minimum that we could get by? Maybe we have 3 first grade classes, and if we absolutely had to, we could combine them into one for a week or two, and we could do it in that area. So what's the minimum that we would need? It's not a normal environment that we could carry through. And then to deal with this both on site or to deal with it remotely, and what other assets would we need listed? Your plan should be telling you those things. Now, Regis went ahead and shared with us, which I was very pleased, their checklist for recovery. Now, you need to then say, wait a minute, that's a business. Let me think about it in terms of my school. What is my checklist and what am I looking for? And I think these questions are good, and areas are a way to start to focus on that. And so these will be included in the brief that we will be sharing with you next week. But if you wanted to jot some down or take a screenshot, you could certainly do so. You know, how close is it to you? What size and capacity are available? What's your budget? What will your school be able to pay and do? Is this dedicated or open seating that would be? If it's going into another school, you're going to be mixing the two populations. How does that work out, or a church? physical and non-physical security issues. This is both keeping control of your materials, the physical security from a safety standpoint, and then the intellectual property and the confidentiality that's associated with it. Getting mail to the new location, reliability that it's going to work. So you would create your own list as you're starting to think about that location and the level of needs, because it's not just your teachers, it's your students that you're going to have to include. Well, so what are the staff requirements? What's their motivation to go to that location? Are we going to reimburse because it's a different environment? Are you going to deal with that? By the way, if you're not going to be open, are you going to be refunding tuition, and how does your insurance play? Again, in any of these areas, I strongly encourage you to take your scenario, give it to your insurance broker, and have them explain to you how your insurance would respond in that area. Staff security, staff working from home. If you've got teachers who are using remote learning from home, what's the impact on your workers' compensation, your general liability, many of the other elements? Thinking about those aspects in advance make a difference. A slip and fall at home, if they're working remotely, would then be covered, and how does that relate to their homeowners and other coverages? Now, if you want to confirm your numbers, it's space and seat number requirements. I understand in a perfect environment you'd have a desk for every child. But if we're in a disaster recovery area, maybe we're just sitting down on the floor and conducting it in that manner. So what's your workaround? What are the minimum numbers that you have to have? And how do those requirements change over time? You might start out with slower because a lot of people have been displaced, and maybe you're doing a hybrid, some remote learning and some physical learning, but eventually we hope people are coming back and you're able to carry that forward along the way. And then what are your interdependencies on? And we talked about hygiene, we've talked about sanitation and water, we've talked about food, and even a location. A Regis might be helpful for your leadership to at least have a place to go and start to work out and coordinate from. Or maybe that your people go there and broadcast their learning from a Regis facility could be another area. So what are your technology requirements? What hardware do you need to have? By the way, do they have a copy of their curriculum on a flash drive so that they could operate from home in that period of time? Because if it's trapped on a computer at school and they didn't take it home with them, they won't be able to recover it in this type of an environment. So identifying these elements in advance becomes extremely important. And then what are the regulatory requirements? By the way, the word organizations was on an earlier slide, spelled with an S also. Regis is a global company headquartered out of Switzerland, so there are organizations with an S, not a Z, associated with it. But you've got so many days, so many hours that you have to put into place. Thinking about what those requirements and that you want to do, you certainly don't want to lose accreditation or do anything that would jeopardize those elements associated with it. Safety, security, they're regulatory environments. That what are those, what do they mean to us, and how do we do them when we're not doing school as we normally do? So if we were thinking about all these things and you wanted to kind of summarize them up, again, what to look for. The available locations. Remember, we talked about the 1 mile radius, the 10-mile radius, the 20-mile radius from where you are. Finding those locations, putting agreements in place. Are they furnished? And if you don't, you probably won't be able to recover in any meaningful way the desk and the other materials in your school. You certainly won't high-speed internet access. And in most cases, in today's world, your computer can become a phone fairly easily with headsets or even using the mics associated with it. But practicing that and understanding, testing these things, you must test this environment and looking at that. And if you're going to another facility, is that if you declared an emergency and you needed to go, do you have an understanding with them that you could go there today? Even if you knew about it today and said, we're going to close today and open tomorrow, you may need to go there to organize that space to serve you within those period of times. You also want to know, are you the only group that has an agreement with this particular location to recover to, because you certainly don't want to have contention at that point in time. Look, when we're in an event like this, we all help each other. Regis did a wonderful thing in the Houston area. They provided access to their space to any business outspaced by Hurricane Harvey, so they could come in and work in their lounge area and lobby, but that gave them access to electricity to charge, internet access. They could do phone access. They could immediately have restrooms, electricity, things to do to be able to operate. And I think that was a significant commitment there. But if you had it in your area, where would you go and where would you get those abilities to recharge? Because remember, those phones aren't going to last very long if there's no electricity at your home or at your school. If this had been a school environment and you see the standing water around it, whatever was going on in that particular building isn't going to be going on there immediately after that. So trying to wait until and after an event to the generosity of a third party that you don't have a relationship to help you run your school and to continue school is not a good business strategy. We now know these events happen. We've seen it with the hurricane season this year at a heightened level. California, they're seeing it with wildfires. We're working with a company there that their employees have been very concerned about earthquake because they had a large group that had strong relationships back to Mexico, and they see the disruption that would occur. So I would encourage you to now think about those and start to build. Now, the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools has greatly underwritten this webinar series and learning, and we're committed to do that. But it also provides you a sounding board. Who are the members in your area that are part of the Tennessee Association? You might want to set up a reciprocity agreement directly with them. If something happens at your school, we'll be your backup, and the other school would be your backup at that point in time. If it happened to both of you, you would need somewhere else, but at least that gives you an idea that you've got someone that's facing the same areas, and going through the planning process together would be extremely helpful. So I would encourage you to take that as a first step. There is a brief from today's webinar, and as there is in every webinar that we do in the series, and it will be up on our website next week. You would go to firestorm.com/briefs, and you can download it. By the way, if you go to that site, you'll also be able to listen to a recording of this particular webinar, or you could share it with others in your school and they can listen to that. And again, that's available at no cost. So there's a lot of things to consider and do. If you've got questions, go